Let's go. And so I'll just see if I can share my screen. Yeah. Full screen. Great. Okay. Welcome everyone. Welcome students. Delighted to be part of this event. So in many ways, part of what I'll be talking about will be a little bit of history, and then as well work through some this particular research topic, and then end up with a what we're doing right now with a NERC large grant starting next week, which is to look at these questions. So we're all will have heard of the role of western boundary currents for heat transfer, particularly in the North Atlantic, the role of the Gulf Stream in redistributing heat. That's commonly accepted as being part of the process by which Western Europe winters are relatively mild. In fact, a large part of that involves exchanges with the atmospheres as well. But that role of the western boundary currents, or the Gulf Stream, has been less recognized for the biogeochemistry. And it's that role that I wish to address today. There's been a history of papers looking at this. Every 5 to 10 years, there's a kind of burst of papers, but and the first one on this was in 1991. Jose Pellegre and Shanade, followed up by another paper of theirs in 96. But then there have been long periods where this process has been somewhat ignored. And then in 2020 or 2021, there were 2 papers linking it to Earth system model projections. So this has been a topic which has been in many ways under-addressed, but I believe is of order one importance for how we understand how the ocean works. So I'll be talking about this issue of nutrient transfers, which this schematic is trying to convey, and looking at it through this viewpoint of the western boundary currents playing a crucial role, and thinking about the wider implications. So in many ways, the starting point of this is, or in many ways, in context to place all of the work, is in the work of Sarmiento and Gruber, where they focused on the role of the Southern Ocean and the transfer of macronutrients, which can be shown in this section, high phosphate concentrations being transported northwards over the basin. Sorry, the screen doesn't respond. Yeah. And if we plot the distributions of nutrients along a potential density surface, we can see high concentrations of phosphate star nutrient, which spread from either the Southern Ocean or the Labrador Sea. So looking at that in more detail, they focused on the distributions of nitrate and silicate. This is showing the enhanced concentrations around in Antarctica. And they particularly focused on the mismatch between the nitrate and silicate distributions, and argued that this mismatch was useful to understand how nutrients spread over the world's ocean. So they invoked a silica star tracer defined by the mismatch between the silica and the nitrate, silica Si star. And this distribution we can see on the poleward side of the circumpolar current, very high values. And then due to the excess silicate, and then a region of negative values linked to the silicate having lower concentrations, but there still being nitrate. They then looked to see how this connected to the rest of the world's oceans, and showed that over much of the global ocean, apart from the North Pacific, we can see negative values of this silica star as marked in blue. That then points to the source of those nutrients being from the Southern Ocean. But they then posed a question or a conundrum as to how were those nutrients redistributed from the Southern Ocean over thousands of kilometers and into the low latitudes of the northern hemispheres. So the answer to that, in my view, is provided by a very insightful paper by Jose Pelegre now in Barcelona, and Shanade, who's now retired, but was I think was working in North America. What they did was take a series of sections across the path of the Gulf Stream, and this is a section running across this section at 36 North, and this is showing the high velocities associated with the Gulf Stream. And then they combined that with the accompanying nitrate measurements to work out a flux. So these contours are representing the horizontal flux of nutrients carried through this section. And so we can see there's this subsurface plume or pipeway by which nutrients have been fluxed very effectively along the path of the Gulf Stream. Not detected at the surface, there'd be no satellite signal of that process, but beneath the surface, there was this plume of nutrients. They wrote a series of papers on that, but certainly to begin with, these papers were not heavily cited or really taken on board. So I want to, the main thrust of my talk is to address why this phenomenon is important in redistributing nutrients and discuss its controls. So I was involved in a field study, raised the money, but the measurements were led by Elaine McDonough, where sections were run across the whole of the Atlantic, but two sections were run at 36 North across the Gulf Stream. And with this field data, you could see in red here the high velocities associated with each of these sections. Then here is the nitrate distribution, high concentrations at depth, low, almost eroded nutrients in the surface waters. And then the product of the velocity and the nitrate flux is shown here. And so we see this subsurface plume, a subsurface pipeway, effectively, by which nutrients are being delivered perpendicular to this section. If we look upstream, and we do a similar section at Florida Strait, you can see the same signal there, that this is the nutrient stream at Florida Strait, where the nutrients in densities denser than 26.5 and 27 are being carried by this boundary current. So how are the nutrients supplied to this nutrient stream? And there have been various debates about that, and I'll come to that later. But Jamie Poulter and Susan Lozier did a nice study where they compiled all the historical profiles of phosphate since 1950, as marked by these black dots, and then on a particular density surface, plotted those. And they made the point that the higher nutrient concentrations that you can see running along the Gulf Stream here are not being imported from the interior of the subtropical gyre. They are instead being imported from further south, from either the tropics or southern latitudes. So we then also did model studies to show this process, and this was a model study where we used a model configured in density coordinates, and this is a plot of the nitrate transport carried by the strong flows, and we see a signal, this high value of the nutrients being carried along the boundary current and further into the subpolar gyre. We can look at this in more detail in the region where the Gulf Stream leaves the coast, and we can see there's all sorts of different pathways there, but crucially, high concentrations of nutrients, typically 26.1, are being fluxed in, and slightly lower concentrations are being fluxed out at the northern end. So there has been an internal debate about what modifies the properties of the nutrients running along the boundary current. Bill Jenkins and Scott Doney set out a very plausible view that along the western boundary layer, there would be regions of enhanced diapicnic mixing, which would almost certainly occur. And the action of that diapicnic mixing would be to transfer nutrients from at depth to surface lighter waters. However, the expectation of that process would be that the nutrient concentrations running along the stream would then increase downstream, and we actually see the reverse. We see it decrease. So an alternative view I've been exploring with Carl Spinges and Alberto Navarro Garabato is that there can also be eddies, mesoscale eddies can stir properties along density surfaces. And we did a field study over the Mid-Atlantic Ridge to show that this isopycnic stirring could be an important process. Now, for the Gulf Stream region, we would expect this stirring to actually transfer nutrients from the nutrient-rich Gulf Stream into the interior, so would dilute the nutrient concentrations. Now, we haven't tested that yet, but that is part of what we want to do in our field program I'll discuss at the end of this presentation. So then there's the question of, okay, we've got this intense nutrient pathway. What does it do to the system? The first point is that one should acknowledge that this subsurface nutrient stream is carried along density contours. So if you plot this nutrient transport in density space, we can see that there's high concentrations of this transport in density surfaces extending from 26.6 to 27.4. So the nutrients carried in this nutrient stream will be carried along density layers until they outcrop into the mixed layer. And where they outcrop, where those nutrients are delivered to the surface boundary layer will depend on the end of winter outcrops. So if we look at the end of winter potential density distribution in the mixed layer, we see that sigma 27 is outcropping around 45 to 50 north, effectively separating the subtropical and subpolar gyre. So the lighter half of the nutrient stream is probably remaining within the subtropical gyre, but the denser part of the nutrient stream is definitely being transferred downstream into the subpolar gyre. So I've worked on the mechanism by which volume and traces are transferred from the thermocline into the winter mixed layer. There's been a lot of work originally in the 80s by Leuchten, Pedlowski and Stommel about the subduction process by which fluid moves from the surface boundary layer to the interior. My early work emphasized how the winter mixed layer varied in thickness following ideas of John Woods, and you can then see how the fact that this boundary layer is becoming much thicker affects the exchange between the surface mixed layer and the interior main thermocline. So you can evaluate the flux passing from the ocean interior into this boundary layer. This is showing the advection of volume, where positive values represent a transfer into the winter mixed layer. And so we can see positive values over the Gulf Stream and the subpolar gyre. So fluids being transferred from the thermocline into the interior. You can then work out the nutrient flux that is carried with this volume, and you see high nutrient concentrations, a high nutrient flux being transferred into this boundary layer. This is involving both a purely vertical transfer and a horizontal transfer. If you just focus on the vertical transfer, and this is the prevailing view in most textbooks and most studies, then your vertical exchanges would be primarily set by the wind stress curl and the Ekman pumping or upwelling, and the vertical transfer of nitrate would be set by the Ekman upwelling times the nitrate concentration. If you work out this transfer, it's much, much weaker by, it's at least a quarter of the size of this nitrate flux into the mixed layer. So our view was that the transfer from the nutricline or the stratified thermocline into the winter mixed layer, and that transfer of nutrients is being achieved by this slantwise transfer into this deepening of the mixed layer. And our thesis or view that those transfers into the winter boundary layer are ultimately fed by the nutrient stream. So the nutrient stream redistributes nutrients very effectively along the western boundary, and then that feeds in to a transfer into long density surfaces, and eventually to the end of winter mixed layer. So that's all a data and model perspective, but why might we care? This is a study by Taglis, Ito, and Braca from about 2 years ago. And they looked at a series of climate models, GFDL, IPSL, MPI, CSM, and they noted that it was a coordinated signal of a weakening in the current speed over a 30-year average when they project forward in time. And their argument was that that weakening was then associated with a reduction in the phosphate concentrations over the North Atlantic. A similar perspective was provided by Dan Witt and Janssen, completely independent study, where they used very simplified balances to interrogate the response of a climate model. And they found that the high latitude biological productivity declined in time. And it declined for two different reasons. It declined because of a weakening in the vertical mixing, and it declined because of the ocean overturning, weakening. And actually, the stronger response was because of the effect of the weakening in the overturning. So they argued that the slower slowing down of the nutrient stream then reduces biological productivity in the subarctic Atlantic Ocean. So this then is, we would argue, is directly relevant to questions about how our carbon sink will vary in the future. In the last IPCC report, a central outcome of that report was that the natural carbon sinks provided by the land and the ocean become less effective in time. And we see that response in the models. Now, in many ways, the prevailing interpretation of what sets those responses is that there is a surface warming, the mixed layer shoals and stratification increases, and then there's reduced communication with the ocean interior, and so a weaker carbon sink. But from what I've shown you, there are other processes also occurring. So certainly, there's the possibility of the carbon sink instead weakening from the overturning circulation and the strength of these nutrient streams weakening. So what we are doing now is doing a program to test out the importance of the nutrient stream. So this is a jointly funded UK Natural Environmental Research Council grant with NSF in the USA. It's involving a range of researchers in the US and the UK, particularly Lisa Beale at Miami, Pete Brown at National Oceanography Center, Alberto Navarro-Arrobato at Southampton, myself at Liverpool, Danny Jones at the British Antarctic Survey, and Robin Turina at SAMS in Scotland. And there are three themes to this. The first theme is trying to document how nutrients are transported at the Florida Strait and putting in moorings to measure the nutrient concentration and to link with existing velocity measurements there to get the fluxes. Then a set of field work involving gliders and profiling floats to evaluate the imprint of the diapicnic mixing acting across density surfaces, much as Bill Jenkins envisaged, and examining the extent that that's offset by the effect of mesoscale eddies in stirring nutrients along density surfaces, and looking at this, the competition between those two effects. And then lastly, looking at the downstream outcomes of that, looking at what happens when those properties outcrop and how that affects the downstream uptake of carbon. So to sum up then, what I've tried to provide to you is a kind of slightly historical view of how a nutrient stream operates along western boundary currents. The nutrients are fluxed along the stream within the subtropical gyre, and those nutrients are really originating from the Southern Ocean or from nutrients upwelled in the tropics. Along the path of the Gulf Stream, the nutrient concentrations there are modified by physical processes involving diapicnic mixing and eddy stirring, and that alters the detailed downstream changes in nutrient concentrations. The important thing is that those nutrients carried along the stream end up being fluxed into the surface boundary layer. And when they're in the surface boundary layer, they can be, they help sustain nutrient concentrations so the biology can utilize those nutrients. And then from model studies, what we're seeing is that a weakening in the overturning is reducing the strength of this process. And that might well be important for what the future holds. Okay, thanks very much.